Good evening, everybody. I wish you a warm welcome to tonight's session for the lecture series Global Narratives of Disinformation Focus on Russia, organized from the Slavic Seminar at Zurich University. My name is Gesine Drews-Sylla. I teach Slavic Studies at the University of Würzburg, Germany. And one of my research areas are the entanglements of the former Soviet Union with the global South, in my case, especially Senegal. And therefore, I am honored to chair the session today. And I'm excited to learn more about what troubles me a lot, Russian propaganda in Africa. So thank you very much for inviting me to be the chair and the discussant today. Before devoting all of our attention to our speaker, a quick remark to those of you who want to listen to this lecture in Russian. There is a simultaneous translation, and you just have to hit the little globe button in Zoom. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker of this evening. Mufutau Muyiwa joins us from Erfurt University, where he pursues a doctoral degree at the Department of Media and Communication Studies. He is also a junior lecturer and a research associate in international and comparative communication at the University of Erfurt. His first degree, he obtained it at the University of Olabisi Onabanjo in Nigeria, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in mass communication. And he's been in this field ever since. He holds 2 master degrees, which he both obtained at German universities in Ilmenau and Erfurt. And one of these degrees is in media and communication science, the second one in global communication, politics and society. He also holds a certificate in global environmental governance from Lund University in Sweden. Mufutau has not only been productive in academic work, but also in journalism and in practical fields in his area of expertise, digital media and communication. His dissertation project traces the origins and scope of cultural diplomacy on the African continent. It aims to contextualize and deconstruct the diplomacy architecture and strategic communication programs of state, non-state, and institutional actors under different political systems. His primary target regions are Nigeria and South Africa. And today's talk is connected to this field. It will introduce us to manufacture and influence Russia's disinformation strategy structures, narratives, and footprints in West Africa. So I look forward to this presentation, and with this, I hand over the virtual microphone to you, Mufutau. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gesine. I couldn't have asked for a better introductory statement, so thank you very much. And a big thanks to the organizers for the invitation. So as Gesine has rightly mentioned, my name is Mufutau Muyiwa. I'm a researcher based at the University of Erfurt in Germany. So I'm interested in, African norms of political communication, media flows and counter flows between African countries and the West, and what I also call the rest. Particularly how media narratives can be used to influence receptivity to national politics and to achieve political outcomes. So thank you very much. So today I will be speaking about on the topic manufacturing influence, Russia's disinformation strategy, structures and footprints in West Africa. Next slide, Gesine. So, and this brings us to the most perplexing question. Why do states invest considerable resources in international broadcasting, which is a subset of public diplomacy, a departure from traditional norms of diplomacy, as we all know it? Why do states invest so much resources, in electronically projecting news and information for strategic engagement with foreign audiences? In a world of, global politics, language, rhetorics, discourses, narratives, and images are indispensable in making sense of political development. So the battle is changing. It's now a war of narratives. So here's the agenda. First, we will deconstruct the concept of international broadcasting and its use in contemporary politics as a vehicle of soft power. And then we will look at Africa's strategic importance, why has Africa suddenly become the diplomatic battleground between Russia, China, and the West. Then we will also look at the scope and principles of Russia today as a state-owned and state-sponsored international broadcaster. We will also look at disinformation campaigns and some of the narratives deployed by Russia and the historical context of these narratives and how local actors in African states appropriate these narratives. Next slide. So it's of fundamental importance to understand the underlying principle behind international broadcasting and its functions. First, states use international broadcasters to promote certain agenda and to frame political events, political issues, and to give their own position about political development and other phenomenon, of course. So international broadcasters are instrumental in shaping global narratives by focusing on framing events and the position of the sponsoring country. They are also very instrumental in countering narratives because they provide, a deliberative platform to counteract the narratives of rivals in the world of competing and conflicting ideological and political interests. International broadcasters are also critical, if we consider them within the context of foreign policy and the transmission of political values, because they are very instrumental when it comes to persuasion and aligning foreign audiences with a country's policy preference to achieve political outcomes. They are also very vehicles by which nations promote cultural distinctiveness, so the so-called nation branding. And they are very critical for image cultivation and engagement programs because they convey content, showcasing a country's rich history, cultural prestige, using different, entertainment and cultural formats, of course. Next slide. And this brings us to the question, why Russia, why image cultivation in Africa? So this is of particular importance, given, political developments, in global politics, the tensions between Europe and Russia, of course. It's not news. I think we all are familiar with that. So Russia have invested considerable resources in gaining new levers of influence and creating new alliances beyond the West. Next slide. So creating new alliances, is a core principle of Russia's international broadcasting and image cultivation programs. Diplomatically, Russia seeks votes in support of its position. And so they cut, African countries and African leaders, to gain support, to gain leverage when it comes to institutional arrangements and decision making. So Russia also frames itself as an anti-jihadist force, in the context of economic and security cooperation with African countries. So, but beyond all of that, they are interested in promoting cultural values, influencing political attitudes, and receptivity to its policies, as we will discover in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So, early rendition of African countries, propagated the orientation that African countries offered little or no strategic value, no strategic relevance in global politics. But that's changing. African countries are becoming very relevant in international politics, and Russia is quick to realize that, and using certain strategic narratives, to form alliances with African countries in what it promotes as partnership of the equals, a direct reference or criticism to, what is widely considered in existing literature as partnership of the unequals in reference to the relationship between African countries and the West. So, African countries can trust Russia as a strategic partner to counterbalance Western influence. The narratives are anchored on this, as we will discover again in subsequent slides. And Russia is saying, okay, we do not have a policy of intervention. It's all about authentic engagement. It's all about partnership of the equals, relationship on equal footing, mutual interest rather than unilateral interest. So these are the core principles of Russia's engagement efforts. But as we all know, a foreign policy doctrine can be different from the reality. So we go to the next slide to discover the scope and principles of Russia today as an international broadcaster. So Russia today is primarily targeting audiences outside the West, particularly in African countries. They are pushing narratives to promote a positive image of Russia. And how are they doing this? They are using the power of technology, the power of television network to offer news, documentaries, commentaries. They are using the Sputnik, a news agency and radio broadcaster, to transmit news information in multiple languages to multiple local languages in many African countries. And this linguistic component makes their messages resonate amongst the general population in many of these African countries. So the key strategy for Russian propaganda is to take advantage of existing dissatisfaction and historical suspicion, among historical suspicion against the West among its target audiences, and to collaborate with the local media, local influencers, etc., etc. I'll delve deeper into this as we will discover. Next slide, please. So this gives us an overview of Russia today's strategy and narratives, the principles of this strategy, of course, and the intensity of their information activities. They are promoting narratives, woven around sovereignty and non-intervention, which they claim is a deviation, from Western patterns of engagement. The core principles of this are broadcast, the use of news commentaries in multiple languages. They collaborate with local media. They have a robust network of influencers, with a view to influencing public opinion. Particularly, they have an elitist focus rather. And the idea is also, image cultivation to expand its political, cultural, and ideological sphere of influence. Next slide, please. So, how is Russia doing this, or how is Russia today doing this? First, of course, they spread pro-Kremlin narratives of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as this has generated, demarcation in global politics. Those that are against Russia's invasion and countries, that are in support, or countries that have chosen to be neutral, as we may have observed in recent times. They also pay influencers to frequently post anti-Western and pro-Russian content in local languages. And this means the reach of these messages it has far-reaching effects, and resonates amongst the target audiences. They also hijack the social media accounts of authentic journalists in many of these African countries and transmit pro-Russian messages and content using these social media accounts for, as a propaganda channel. But if you look to the right, you will see it's primarily about local media and influencers to reinforce frames. It's primarily about pro-Russian leaders in these African countries who also use these narratives to legitimize their positions. For more often than not, they evoke history of colonialism, um, to play the blame game, as an explanation for the adverse socioeconomic conditions in many of these African countries. And it's more about, what in existing research is described as political oligarchic patronage networks, they also exploit the endemic corruption in many African countries, and to transmit their messages. And it makes it very easy. Endemic corruption makes it very easy for them to find willing actors, and collaborators in many African countries. So this patronage-based model of politics and economic interest is reflected in how Russia engages, African audiences today. They exploit, personal networks, loyalties, and they undermine institutional relationships to foster their own national interest and to push certain narratives. So this local media, for example, an influencer reinforce frames of moral evaluation, as a basis for the adverse socio-economic conditions in African countries, blaming Western hegemony, blaming, colonialism, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So first, this gives us an overview of the political communication technique, which I call subversion. And that is the fact that first, they not only discredit democratic values in many African countries. This image that I used here is from my home country, Nigeria, during a protest in September, where some of the protesters were seen waving Russian flags. So this means Russia is also fueling disillusionment, a sense of disillusionment in many of these countries. And that's, I mean, it's a combination of diplomatic and cultural outreach, because they are also, they also have arrangements, to sponsor students from African countries, offering generous scholarships to study in Russia. But they are also, casting aspersion on the electoral integrity in many of these countries, spreading falsehoods and all that, which um, um, has severe implications for social cohesion, political stability in these countries. Next slide, please. So here is a video, a short one. I would like that we watch the first three minutes of this video, please.
I'm afraid I can't start it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. You just have to. I think you just have to click on the slide, and then it should play automatically.
I might have to leave the presentation mode to get into the video.
Oh, okay, maybe that works. Let's see if that works.
Okay, so I will stop this. And okay, I'm back in a second.
Okay, yeah, that's absolutely fine.
I will share again. Now we should. No, doesn't work.
Doesn't work?
It doesn't work. The administrator of the organization has deactivated this function.
Okay. Then we can proceed with the next slide. Sorry about that. But I can give you a summary. It's just an example of how, you know, Russia is using influencers in many of these African countries, actually paying them, you know, social media influencers who have a robust, you know, following on social media, you know, and you know, they are collaborating with these influencers to push anti-Western rhetorics and pro-Russian content, of course. So that's just you know, a summary of the video. So we can move to the next slide, please. So one of Russia the programs that Russia sponsors is known as the African Stream. By the way, this has been banned on YouTube and by the US government as well recently. But before then, the African Stream was very, very effective, you know, when it comes to pushing, you know, anti-Western sentiments, really, really dangerous narratives. But Russia camouflaged this as, you know, giving a voice to all Africans, both at home and abroad. But it is primarily a vehicle for propaganda on social media. So this map also gives us, you know, an overview of Russia's disinformation campaigns in Africa. Yep. The next slide, please. So let's take a look at some of the narratives for anti-colonial and anti-Western themes to expose colonial legacies. This is something that Russia is doing a lot. Russia today is doing a lot in African countries. They are using human interest stories to illuminate, you know, Western exploitation in Africa, tracing the history of colonialism, you know, to contemporary politics and saying, you know, Russia is exploiting the African continent and its resources, etc., etc. So they are using this as a basis to evangelize, you know, the need for African sovereignty, you know, liberation and global multipolarity. They are also using these human interest stories to project the increasing, you know, discontent with Western institutions in many African countries. You know, a good example is that they are, you know, Russia today is amplifying the increasing anti-French sentiment in former French colonies, and you know, this also explains the increasing receptivity to Russia in many, you know, French-speaking West African countries, and the growing resentment against France as a former colonial power in many of these countries. So, to a large extent, you know, you can see that, you know, the narratives are really, you know, working when it comes to the elites and when it comes to, you know, the larger population in many of these countries. The next slide, please. So, as part of its narratives, you know, Russia is also, you know, evoking, you know, Soviet era prestige, you know, and also making references, you know, to historical incidents, you know, examples where Russia condemned Western exploitative practices where Russia has opposed, US and NATO interventions in African countries, to say, oh, we are a moral actor. Russia is a great country. We are a moral actor. And they also used the COVID pandemic, to push narratives saying, oh, we defeated smallpox, don't trust Western vaccines. You should trust, Russia's vaccine. Don't trust Western vaccines because they have ulterior motive, to reduce the population. So many falsehood, was spread among the African population during at the height of the COVID pandemic. The next slide, please. So Russia is also, on one hand, promoting its traditional values, and and how this is consistent with African cultural values as a way to discredit Western values, and gender norms. They are also very critical of Western aid and policies in some of these narratives that they're propagating in African countries. The next slide, please. So Russia's invasion in Ukraine is also at the forefront of these narratives, to also gain sympathy and support for its war efforts in Ukraine. They highlight, Western double standards to conflict, for example, and more explicitly, as we will see in the next slide, the historical context of some of these narratives. So this is an extract from my dissertation. I describe this as factors that has made Russia's narratives, Russia's engagement efforts to be effective. I describe it as complex condescension. On one hand, contemporary engagement effort, Russia's contemporary engagement efforts in Africa is less state-centric. They are making use of, non-state actors, business actors, but it's also very opportunistic and anchored on Soviet-era propaganda. And direct intervention in African states in which US and its allies had strong interest. So this means, they are trying to, this has been largely successful in former French colonies, for example. So what they are doing is trying to dismantle the stronghold of, Western superpowers in many of these African countries, as we have seen, in former French colonies. So they are also evoking memories of Western unilateral interest and policies in African countries, and how, Western superpowers ignored, African experiences and voices in information flows, for example. So Russia is also exploiting this resentment and opposition to Western political and cultural influence in Africa, in what is known as a concept that is fast emerging, Western arrogance diplomacy that conceives Africans and its political leaders as passive recipients, reinforcing colonial and neo-colonial stereotypes and attitudes, for example. So, in a nutshell, they are relying on historical legacy of Soviet support for African liberation movement. This is a key component of Russia's narratives, the narratives they push in many African countries, and this is facilitated by the fact that they have no colonial baggage, and Russia is really using this as an approach. They are playing the no colonial baggage card in many of these countries, and they are also fueling narratives about post-colonial narratives surrounding post-colonial disillusionment with Western hegemonic practices, for example, and colonial and neo-colonial histories of Western powers is something that they are constantly bringing to the forefront, when they engage with African audiences. So let's wrap this up with a summary of everything that we've mentioned here before I entertain the questions. So Russia today engages in competitive framing, um, and I think it's very fundamental to note that they not only compete with Western narratives, they also compete with local and private media narratives that aligns with the West. So it's not just narratives, anti-West narratives, but they also try to counter narratives that support the West in many of these countries by the local and private sector media in these countries. So another thing I also think is that what they also do is to promote narratives about shared struggles, the us versus, them ideology. So the battle between oppressed people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the West. This is something that they are doing effectively. Lots of their human interest stories in African countries are also anchored, on exposing the complex colonial legacies in these countries. Political education technique. So it's not just about, diplomacy. It's not just about cultural outreach. There are also, it's a very complex and aggressive approach. I like to describe it as very aggressive because they are using traditional norms of diplomacy. They are using, contemporary norms of, diplomacy to promote Russia's cultural distinctiveness, to promote Soviet era prestige, to position Russia as a collaborator, as a good ally. So that's why they are also offering, generous, scholarship opportunities for African countries. And these scholarship opportunities, the curriculum in Russia, I think studies, there are a few studies that has discovered that the curriculum at Russian universities, for example, are injected, with some, ideological information to influence Africans that are in Russia to pursue higher education, for example. And it's important to also note that local radio stations regularly broadcast Sputnik and RT content to African audiences in local languages that the people can, understand. So it's not just elitist, it's also, a very grassroots approach. And they're also using social media to devastating effect, spreading memes, videos, commentaries to amplify pro-Russian content in African countries. Yeah, I think that will be it from my side. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Oh my God, I just saw that the slides were in the wrong mode. I didn't see the chat. I'm sorry. It was covered by the wrong screen. I apologize to the audience out there and to Mufutau. I'm sorry, I didn't see it. So we will have the discussion now via Q&A. So you can ask your questions via the Q&A section. And while I wait for the questions to come in, and I see they start coming in, I would like to ask a question of my own. When I had a look at the case of Senegal recently, I noticed that the Ukrainian perspective is hardly present at all. So it is basically the Russian narrative and the Russian perception or the perception of what the local economy or the local society or the local conditions, how they depend on Russia, for example, for grain, etc., that are being discussed. So the Ukrainian side is muted. Is this the same in the material you were going through? Is this like one of the sad realities of the effects of these propaganda techniques?
I would say partially yes. We also, after Russia's invasion, Ukraine launched, a charm offensive, in many African countries, But I think, the major shortcoming of Russia's, Ukraine rather, sorry, Ukraine's diplomatic apparatus is that before the invasion, Africa was not, they didn't actively engage with African countries. This is the problem. But Russia, on the other hand, has this, history of engagement with African countries, and this of course dates back to the Soviet era when African countries joined the non-alignment movement, of course, to demonstrate their neutrality during the Cold War era. But I think it's primarily due to the fact that Africa is not a key component of Ukraine's foreign policy, could I say, policy overtures before the invasion. And they try to, correct this, but they are also slow to do that, because image cultivation is something that you build over time. Soft power is not something you get instantly. The capacity to co-opt foreign audiences and foreign elites is something that you build over the course of time. It's not something that happens overnight, and I think Ukraine has realized this. They're trying to change that, but it's probably too late because Russia already invaded. Yeah.
Thank you. But isn't that also due to the fact that Russia inherited all of the diplomatic networks that were already existing and Ukraine had to build up new ones?
Yeah, partly so. But I think it's primarily, there are so many small states, okay, that tries to engage. We can think of Qatar, for example, punching above its weight. I totally agree. On one hand, Ukraine didn't have, the existing networks, the, information machinery, and all that. And, Russia, on the other hand, has, a large, diplomatic arsenal, But I think it's also primarily because, if you look at history, we do not have much exchanges between Ukraine and African countries, in terms of if we consider it within the context of cultural engagement or exchanges, there has been little or none of that, and the consequences of this, are replayed, in what is currently happening in the Ukraine today. So it's more about last minute, diplomatic, overtures, but that cannot trigger immediate result.
One last thing I was wondering about before I turn to the questions in the Q&A section is that there were many Africans who studied in the Soviet Union. So these networks still exist. And I do not have any data where they studied, whether they studied mostly in today's Russia, or whether there was a significant amount of students coming from Ukraine. So I was wondering whether you noticed any in the local discussions that were led, whether you noticed any differences in approaches of local actors with a past of a student and education in the Soviet Union today with regard to the war, or whether this is totally absent.
That is a very interesting question. If you look at existing literature, existing research, we know it's. I would say it's a black box. It's a blind spot. We do not know much about this. But what I mean, the influencers, for example, the influencers that Russia collaborates with have practically practically never lived in Russia. Of course, they get invitations, to attend events in Russia, but they never studied there. They've never lived there. So it's about, financial gratification. Russia is, paying these influencers to promote, pro-Russian content and messages and condemn the West. So little is known about, Africans that have studied, in the Soviet during the Soviet era. I think this is a blind spot and an area that future research can explore.
Thank you. Okay, now let's turn to the questions from the audience. The first reaction which came in immediately was more or less, or is more or less, an outcry of exasperation. The question is, I have to ask in German, will paraphrase it, whether there are any chances, in your opinion, any chances to be sensed against this overwhelming propaganda machine for democracy and for reason, actually. That's what the questions asks.
That's a German a translation. The question was asking.
It was asked in German.
Can you please repeat that? I'm not sure.
Okay, it's more or less an outcry of desperation, because it seems that the Russian propaganda machine seems to destroy reason and democracy and honesty. And the question to you is, do you see any chances?
Okay, I hope I can just do justice to that. Yes, there's no doubt that Russia is, discrediting, Western democratic values and governance. There's no doubt that Russia is, supporting dictatorial tendencies, supporting authoritarian regimes in African countries. I think that's very clear. And Russia has never been favorably disposed to Western style, democracy. And they're doing everything, to undermine that in many of these African countries. For example, questioning, electoral integrity, spreading falsehood, about, electoral outcomes. They did this in Nigeria during the last election, like I said, there's a think tank, that focuses on, researching electoral violence, political developments in African countries, and they observed that Russia hacked the accounts of many journalists, to spread falsehood, different post messages, questioning the electoral integrity, questioning, casting aspersion on candidates, and in some African countries, for example, in the Central African Republic, they actually sponsored. Evidence suggests that they sponsored candidates that are pro-Russian. So this is something that needs to be well researched. In the coming years, but existing evidence suggests that this is the case. Russia are supporting, pro-Russian candidates, in elections. Or, for example, in the case of Central African Republic that I know of, they supported about 9 candidates and then told 8 out of the 9 candidates to support, one particular candidate when it was obvious that he has a better chance of winning. So they are exerting, enormous control on the information space and the political space. So I would say.
The next question turns to China.
Okay.
So it is, how does the Russian involvement in Africa collide with the Chinese one? Do their respective influence taking go hand in hand or complement themselves?
Good question. I mean, I get this question all the time. So um, both countries are allies, and even from my doctoral research, I can safely assume or safely conclude that they play a complementary role. They are both anti-West, and so they complement each other. There's no evidence of any conflict or tension in the between both countries in the information space. So I would say um, um, China pushes its own narratives. China has its own. Um, I think for China, it's primarily about economic interest, but for Russia, it's both economic and political interest. And I would also say, Russia is also, positioning itself as a security partner, if particularly in the context of, anti-terrorism efforts in many of these countries. So that's not something that China is particularly concerned about, but China is also pushing narratives, but not narratives that tries to counter, or undermine Russia's influence in African countries, I would say. So it's more complementary.
Mhm. Thank you. There are several questions on Wagner, on the Wagner mercenaries
Yeah.
in Africa, and they kind of complement each other. And I think many of the questions are interested in the effects of the absence of the Wagner mercenaries. So how does the fact that the Wagner mercenaries, or some of them were withdrawn, act on the or has influence on on the image of Russia in Africa? Is there any influence? Is there a decreased amount of propaganda to be sensed? So can you say anything about that?
Yes, of course. I think what we have seen in recent times is a departure. Russia is trying to correct the negative perception, that the Wagner Group, as in African countries, they're trying to depart, from that and to correct that. For example, they have the African core, um, which was established, I think, last year or early this year, to shape narratives. So, I mean, they are moving away from, an emphasis on military presence, security cooperation, because the Wagner Group likely has, negative reputation in many of these African countries. Of course, on one hand, we can say, okay, they were critical to the, anti-terrorism effort in these countries, but in many instances, the Wagner Group also failed. So I think now Russia is, much more concerned about, information engagement rather than, rather than shaping perception, using, its military presence, occasioned by its affiliation with the Wagner group. So I think, Russia has realized that, it's not good for its perception, its reputation in these countries, and they are doing that less in at least in recent years.
Okay. Would you say that there are, I'll read out one of the comments, is Russia has long had a strong influence in the Sahel region, specifically in Mali and Niger.
That's right.
Spreads its state narratives accordingly. With regard to the PMC Wagner in particular, it can be said that the PMC had a real fan base in certain states until its dissolution with fan shirts, posters, etc. How is this narrative with Russia as an alternative to France and the associated popularity of PMCs in African countries? How does it change? Has it changed, or are these fan bases? Are these? Well, we also saw the flags and that all that stuff in the images you showed to us. Is it still there? Is it still around?
Yeah, I would say it's still there. I think the Russian narratives, resonates well, particularly among the young population in many African countries. They have an active presence on social media. So social media is a very important tool or channel for Russia. I'm not sure if that answers the question because I think I lost the focus of the question somewhere. But I would say in protest, for example, in Mali, the population, came out to protest against, the presence of France in the country, and openly, calling for increased, Russian presence, in Mali. So, and Russia today is also capitalizing on this, also, deepening this resentment, French resentment in this country, using narratives. So I think it's now this kind of images are common in many African countries, particularly in the former French colonies, the French speaking West African countries. And I think in recent years, I would say within the last 12 months, Russia is particularly interested in Nigeria and in South Africa. Evidence suggests, that, because I think what they're also trying to do is to dismantle Western influence, where the West has strong influence, then Russia also wants to be there. And where, Western powers have little or no, presence, they also want to be there. So it's a two-pronged, approach, I would say. On one hand, trying to go to where, the West, Western countries or diplomatic, apparatus are not, focusing, and on the other hand, trying to um, uproot, sympathy towards the West in countries where they have strong allies and all of that. So,
Thank you. I mean, you turn to the perception of the former colonial power in West African countries, the French. So maybe that's the point where we can turn to colonialism and colonialism's legacies and the fact that Russia is not perceived as a colonial power. There are several questions on this issue. One of them is how come Russia's operations in Africa, especially the activities of Russian mercenary groups like the Russian Expeditionary Corps, are not perceived as colonial activities in African countries? Is there a discussion in Africa about Russia's imperialism and colonialism?
I would say there's little or no discussion about that. And this is something I attribute to complex condescension in my dissertation. There's this historical suspicion about anything from the West, be it information. There's this, deep-seated distrust, among the for me as well, even as an early stage researcher living in Germany, back home, there's always this mindset that the adverse socioeconomic conditions can be traced to the colonial era, and Russia is, actually capitalizing on this. So, among the older generation, the younger generation, there's this, growing discontent, against anything West, anything American, blaming the global superpowers, for national issues, citing instances of, interventionist policies, coup d'etat, for example, the overthrow of Lumumba in the Congo, so Russia is, uprooting, many of these, historical incidents, and saying to the people, oh, you can trust us, you shouldn't trust the West, because it's always about political interference. It's always about unilateral interest, for Western, superpowers. But for us, we want to engage on equal footing. We do not want to impose, our cultural values. Rather we want, a form of authentic engagement. But is this true? That's a doctrine. But the reality, is far from that. But it's working. It's working. And I would say complex condescension in the sense that Western diplomacy has always been, one-dimensional, and I think this is also something that has, so it's not just about the effectiveness of, Russia's narratives, it's also about the shortcomings, of Western countries. I mean, even if I go to the foreign ministry in Berlin, for example, you'll discover that members of the diplomatic apparatus, for example, in Germany, do not even see, this, increasing Russian presence in Africa as a problem. I think the only superpower that sees this as a problem is the United States, and they're allocating, funds to try to, counter, to neutralize, Russia's disinformation campaigns in many of these countries. But I would say in Europe, it's still not, I mean, perhaps in, Western, academic circles like we are doing now, we are seeing it as a problem. But I would say when it comes um, policy decision making, this is still not conceived as a problem, and it's worrisome. It's really worrisome in my opinion.
Thank you. There are two more questions that relate to these issues. Maybe I'll just read out one of the next ones because it explicitly thanks you for your presentation, Mr. Mufutau. Despite the ambivalent position of Russia in Africa, probably deserves some respect from Africans, considering the fact that it never participated in slave trade and colonization of the continent. What do you think is the disposition of Africans to the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's not just about what I think, but we can all see that African countries have been reluctant to condemn Russia's invasion, you know. So this tells us something. On one hand, they do not want to offend the West because there are still aspects, to which they collaborate. But it has more or less been, they've maintained, a neutral position. They've been very reluctant, to condemn Russia's war efforts. They've openly, agitated for peace, a diplomatic solution rather than a military one. But that's just on the surface. Um, but behind the scenes, and if we look at political events, developments rather, in recent years, I would say, I wouldn't say they are in support, but I would say they are neutral and unwilling to condemn Russia's war efforts. So it's really difficult, to tell, because they are also collaborating with Russia on many levels. For example, South Africa, held a joint military, exercise with China and Russia. They collaborate on many levels. When it comes to economic cooperation, when it comes to cultural exchanges. So I would say the lines are blurred, but one thing is certain, they have refused to condemn Russia, and they've openly agitated for a diplomatic solution to the conflict.
Mhm. Okay, let's turn to another area of questions, which is how do African actors react to being instrumentalized? Do they notice it? That's my question. The question in the chat is, were there any influences who were maybe unconsciously repeating pro-Russian narratives, but who kind of realized what they were doing and changed their content? Have you had any examples of that? Have you seen any examples of that?
No, I've not seen any example of that. I mean, it's difficult to perhaps to change your position when you do not even realize that you're being instrumentalized. That this is the problem. And yeah, another thing is that Russia is using this alternative fact, but to a large extent, what they're just doing is, recycling, information surrounding, colonial, complex colonial legacies. They're just exploiting this, historical suspicion. They're exploiting the socioeconomic conditions and blaming the West, and, its colonial legacies for that. um, I mean, for example, France still, until recently, had a strong hold, on its former colonies, and it's this kind of political realities, that Russia is, creating stories around a spin, around some of, these political realities. So it's really, difficult, to change their position when they do not even realize in the first place that they are being instrumentalized. And um, another problem is the um, if we look at, I think the state actors in Nigeria, they know that this is happening, but I do not know the extent to which they are trying to, put in measures, to neutralize Russia's disinformation campaigns in Nigeria, for example. But I've read lots of official statements. They are aware that perhaps there are indications that Russia is doing this. Maybe it's more about a lack of political will to take action, a lack of political will to invest, resources in this, trying to counter these disinformation campaigns. And this, for me, is the problem. There's no way this can change. There's no way misconceptions can be corrected if these influencers do not know that they are being used, if the local media collaborating with Russia Today or Sputnik do not know that they are pushing contents that are harmful, and that could threaten, political stability, that could undermine social cohesion in these countries. Because I think politically, when we start when we start casting aspersion on electoral integrity, I think we are on the path to political instability, in my opinion. And Russia, of course, is only waiting to weaponize, to hijack this protest. This anti-government, growing anti-government disillusionment. For its own political objectives. This is the case, in my opinion.
Thank you. There was one comment about slave trade in Russia. I would just like to read it out to have it in the open. The comment says, talking about slave trade, the 2023 Global Slavery Index estimates that there are 1,899,000 people, approximately 1.26% of the population, currently living in illegal slavery-like conditions in Russia, according to Russian law. This includes forced labor, forced prostitution, debt bondage, forced serval marriage, exploitation of children and forced prison labor, most belonging to marginalized groups like undocumented immigrants from the Caucasus and former Soviet states. So it's not so that slavery, the memory of slavery, or that slavery was nothing that is of concern regarding Russia, but it's still astonishing that the memory of the cultural memory of Russia being an imperial power, global imperial power, has completely been erased, kind of, and that it is connected with decolonization, with anti-colonial movements, etc. And to that extent, there was a question which I have to find again, which asked about the connections between I can't find it anymore. It was about the connection to, yeah, here it is. Are contemporary Russian disinformation narratives also trying to align Russia with the bloc-free movement or the African Unit movement that were promoted by Kwame Nkrumah or any similar movements? That kind of goes into another direction. It's another path, but it kind of hits this or belongs to this area of Russia or the Soviet Union being part of the anti-colonial forces.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we can, if we want, we can call this Russian exceptionalism. Russia parades itself as the champion of a multipolar world. Positioning itself as an alternative to Western hegemony. Projecting Russia as a moral actor. Um, an actor that is committed to a balanced, global order that respects, in quote, respects African sovereignty. In a continent where the people and the political class are frustrated with, Western dominance, for example, in international institutions like the UN Security Council. I think these kind of narratives, are certain to resonate, and Russia is just playing this game because it actually resonates. They are pushing narratives of, they do not have an interventionist policies, things like this. They are an alternative, to Western, hegemonic control and influence. They just want to engage. It's about mutual interest for them. That's a doctrine, perhaps different from reality. We will see in the coming years, I would say. But that's just the situation. I mean, yeah.
Okay. There are a couple of questions that relate to some of the strategies
Okay.
that are applied. And one of them is on education. The Soviet Union was an educational opportunity for Africans, definitely. And the question is, considering that the Soviet Union already offered scholarships to African students in the 20th century, especially to newly independent states during the era of colonization.
That's correct.
Has the contemporary Russian approach changed considerably?
It has not changed. I mean, like I mentioned, of course, we cannot understate Soviet contributions to helping, African military, educational and political institutions like we've been discussing since. But I think in contemporary times that has not changed. I think I mentioned earlier, Russia has been offering, generous scholarship, opportunities to Africans. But what is unclear, I mean, evidence suggests that they inject, the curriculum, with some, ideological, information to kind of co-opt, Africans who go to Russia to study. But it's unclear if this was also the case, during the Soviet era. We know that's the case now. Studies are, beginning to prove that the image perception of Russia changes considerably, before an African student travels to Russia for higher education and after. So there's a kind of, ideological indoctrination, that occurs during that must have occurred during this process. But if this was also, the same during the Soviet era, is something that is still unclear, is something that has been under-researched, I would say.
Maybe I can add a question of
Yes,
mine at
please.
this point. It also concerns education
Mm-hmm.
and the how do African students relate to educational opportunities in Russia right now? The background of my question is that from the research I know, I believe that African students coming to study in the Soviet Union did
Mm-hmm.
not go there for ideological reasons, most of them. They went there
Mm-hmm.
because it was an educational opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and they, for many of them, it was a good time in their life. It was their youth. They
Mm-hmm.
were fairly well off because they were free to travel. They were among the very little groups of the the Cold War world who could travel freely back and forth from the Eastern to the Western blocks, etc. So for them, it was on the one hand was just an educational opportunity, but it came along with privileges. And after the Soviet Union, there are many narratives about experiences of racism, which increased after the demise of the Soviet Union. And this decreased not only the possibilities of education for Africans in Russia, but also the willingness to go there. But there were still many people who went there, but it was all
Yeah.
about educational possibilities. So how would can you assess the situation now?
I think in assessing the current situation, we also have to look at the socioeconomic realities today in many African countries. Okay, decline, in economic growth. I think, they just see it as an opportunity, an economic opportunity, right now. I mean, of course, there's a motivation to study there, but it's primarily an economic opportunity now. And I think an average young person is, perhaps less concerned, about this kind of things, about some kind of ideological indoctrination. I think that's the least of their worries, given, the socio-economic conditions in many African countries today, Nigeria included. Okay. So, I mean, on one hand, there's this, post-colonial disillusionment. On the other hand, Russia, has launched a charm, offensive, trying to get, young, brilliant Africans, and enticing them with, generous scholarship opportunities, in Russia. And I mean, and this is also because they conceive these young people as political agents. They conceive them as domestic constituents of foreign audiences. So they become ambassadors. After this ideological indoctrination. Maybe that was not the case, like you rightly observed, during the Soviet era, but it's clear that's the case now, and they become ambassadors. They transmit image perception about Russia, back home. But the dynamics of that, it's still something, we will something future research, has to consider. But at the moment, it's still unclear. We know, the ideological indoctrination is there, but the consequences of this and the reputational dividends of this for Russia is something that we will discover in the near future, I would say.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There are a few scattered questions, and one of them is, did Obama's presidency calm this distrust in the West in any way?
Another good question. I mean, I can only give my opinion about this without any, I do not have any empirical evidence, to reinforce that position. Uh, but of course, many African countries were receptive to America's policies, under the Obama administration. But that has changed considerably, between then and now. I think now they're on the policy level, they're trying to African states are trying to detach, from this Western, ideological influences. They're trying to take control and determine their own political destinies. I think this is something that has changed between them then and now. Of course, on one hand, um, the nature of a political leader influences the dynamics and the complexion determines the complexion of foreign engagement. Um, Obama is a charismatic leader and all that, but I think even if we have an Obama presidency right now, I think the situation will not change. As we speak, I don't think the situation will change because I mean, as we can see, um, like I said, they're trying to determine their own political destinies. They're trying to say to shed, their connections, with the West and determine their own political future. And this is also consistent with Russia, what Russia is trying to, promote a multipolar world. You can, free from, economic dependencies, free from, Western, interference. This is consistent with so Russia is saying is pushing, for African sovereignty, for multipolarity, and when you place this within the context, of the complex historical legacy, then I would say this has been largely successful.
There is a question on how successful Russian propaganda strategies are in shifting public opinion in African countries, potentially diminishing France's traditional spheres of influence. I would like to add to that or to differentiate a bit. Would you say that it is Russia's propaganda that contributes to diminishing the influence of the former colonial power France, or is it rather the Russian propaganda taking advantage of the strong currencies that are there anyway? Is it the Russians using this, or is it the Russians contributing to this? Probably you can't detangle this, but still, I would like to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah. I would say on one hand, yes, Russia deepened this resentment, with these narratives, particularly among the young people, who perhaps do not, before now, do not see this. Maybe the older generation, yes, but young people, active on social media. Please don't get me wrong, young people are are not apolitical. They are politically active, consuming political content and information. And on one hand, Russia is exploiting this, pushing this content and this kind of, narratives that, okay, the West is to blame, for the socio-economic realities in your country, the high unemployment rate and all that, it's as a result of Western exploitation, complex historical legacies and all that. But I would say it's much more Russia taking advantage, of this, post-colonial disillusionment with France in particular, among its former colonies. So on one hand, yes, they deepened it, because they were also, uh, pushing narratives that exposes this, the I would say, after effect of, French colonialism. They're bringing this to the fore of public, discourse. On the other hand, they are also taking advantage of the situation. And like I said, it's also about this patronage model. Okay, endemic corruption in many African countries, makes it very easy, to bribe public officials, makes it very easy, to get, influencers, willing to take the pay, to push pro-Russian content that resonates. These influencers are young, they have large followership on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter and the likes. So when they, condemn, Russia, Western exploitative practices, making reference, to particular incidents, and simultaneously, also pushing pro-Russian content, Russia as a moral actor, no colonial baggage, and all that. I think these are the factors that has conspired, to explain the very deep-seated, anti-French sentiments, in many of these countries.
We're approaching the end, and there's one very general question.
Okay.
It reads, doesn't Russia or the Soviet Union have a long tradition of influencing African countries during the war? I would like to add to this question two aspects. I would be interested to which extent the cultural memory of proxy wars, the proxy wars of the Cold War era, are still present, are still discussed, shape the discussions or the perceptions of what is going on in the world, and does it contribute to fears or well, moods in African countries, in your opinion? And the second question I have is also very particular. I know that the Soviet discourse was very interested in promoting local languages. I know that we still need a lot of research to assess this for African countries. I know that they were promoting, for instance, translations into local languages. And now you say this is one of the strategies that is utilized again. And I was wondering, how do they get access to these local languages? Do they use influencers? Do they use local actors to post, like for instance in Wolof or in Fulbe or whatever, on social media, or do they use local actors of local media chains or media channels, for instance, to whom they address via Sputnik? So what are the strategies? What are the techniques in working with local languages, which is a very, very loaded subject in discourses I know?
Yeah. I think it's something we still need to unpack within an empirical framework. But preliminary observations suggest that they collaborate with them. And it's also interesting to note that Russian diplomats are also learning the local languages. It's interesting to note that. Unlike other Western countries, to the best of my knowledge, the US is also investing a lot of, financial resources in understanding, local languages. But if you look at the evaluation of their engagement efforts, they've not been very successful when doing this. And I think this is an area that, in my opinion, Russia has been very successful. I think they've also studied the flaws, the shortcomings of Western, diplomatic overtures in Africa, and they are not willing to commit the same mistakes. So they are collaborating with, the local media, local influencers who have, a direct, relationship, with these people. Honestly, it's all about them pushing these narratives, recycling these narratives in local, languages. So in a way, it's still Russia doing this, and like I said, they pay these influencers, they invite them, for events, in Moscow, and all that. So I can imagine, that they are aware about the agenda, but everything is designed in such a way, that I don't know if what Russia does is to, supply the content, but you can see this, pro-Russian content in different languages in these countries. So I would say there's, very, very cordial um, collaboration, very cordial relationship with the influencers. I think some of these local media, radio stations, for example, already broadcast in local languages, so it's all about, the messaging, the narrative, they just push this. So it's not like they have to create a different, language service to reach a cross section of the population. No, these radio stations, for example, are scattered, across, different regions, and they have areas of reach and penetration. Many, particularly in rural areas, in rural areas where people still rely on, radio transmission to obtain information and all that. So I think that's it, basically. I think I missed your first question. I think this,
It was about the proxy wars, the cultural memory of proxy wars.
The proxy wars. I think it's a very it's a question that's difficult to answer. Um, I would say yes. I wouldn't call it proxy war yet. In Africa, I wouldn't call it proxy war yet. But what is certain is that Russia is supporting political candidates. The extent to which they are doing this, it's still shady. For example, in Zimbabwe, they offered, strong, electoral campaign support to help, presidential aspirants win the elections in 2018. So they have their footprints, in different parts of Africa, trying to support, political candidates that are favorably disposed to Russia, that are pro-Russia. This is the case, and they are working against, candidates inadvertently or deliberately working against candidates that are pro-West. So I think this is, what we can observe, at the moment. Um, if we say proxy wars, then we can consider this within the context of the Wagner mercenaries. But like I said, Russia has also quickly realized the negative implications, of this, and trying to correct that with the African Core and the African Partnership Initiative, which they created recently.
Thank you. But the point I was interested in was whether there is whether African actors are afraid of proxy wars. I'm not sure whether I understood your answer to that question. I mean, are they afraid that the conflicts will unload themselves once again on the African continent, or is it rather that they try to avoid this by trying to play all the possible cards they have? What would you say?
Okay, I will give two answers to that. On one hand, they do not want to be caught in the crossfire, just like during the Cold War, the non-alignment policy. Many African countries joined that, so they do not want to be caught in the crossfire between two global, superpowers back then. The U.S. and its allies, and Russia on the other hand. And in contemporary times, they still do not want to be caught in the crossfire And this relates back to what I said earlier. They want to be able to determine their own political destinies, you know. So on one hand, they collaborate, they cooperate, you know, with the West on many levels, you know, on many levels, and they also, you know, want to keep that channel open, you know, by also, you know, being able to collaborate with Russia without any undue interference or pressure from the West. So it's just, I think it's both, you know, like you observed. On one hand, they do not want, you know, to be at the receiving end, you know, of this, you know, proxy wars or war in the real context of the world. But at the same time, you know, they're also conscious of the fact that, you know, the West and Russia serves, you know, their own, you know, national, economic and political interest. And this explains why, for example, they are willing to condemn Russia's invasion or to openly support Russia's invasion in Ukraine.
Thank you. I think our time is up. There's one, maybe we have time for one last question, which is about migration. I'll try to sum it up, and maybe you can say just one or two sentences. It's about the questions that, or the fact that obviously many Africans still migrate to Europe, and whether this is connected to any political orientations or political opinions of these migrants. Maybe you can say a bit about that.
I mean, it's difficult to answer that because one, I'm not expert on migration. You know, I'm more, you know, into political communication, media narratives, and all that. So I'm not sure I can you know, emphatically answer that or provide any, causal attribution, you know, about okay, why there is a lot of, you know, migration to the West and rather than to Russia. I think it's not something I can answer. I'm sorry, I'm not a migration expert, so I would like to skip that question. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you a lot for the interesting presentation, for the lively discussion. And of course, none of this would have taken place without you asking questions out there and without the organization of the lecture series. So big thank you to all of you. Next week events will also be very interesting. I noticed it will be about steep destabilization campaigns in Moldova, another region in the world which has been in the news lately and which we are anxious to follow. So thanks again to everybody out there, to you, Mufutau, and to the Zurich team.